All right. Okay, we're going to get started. Everybody, this is Matt Duff. Say hi, Matt. So Matt is going to, I guess, just take it from here.
Yeah. All right, sounds good. So I met Bob at a React presentation that Sam Knowles made me attend with him. So I've known Sam since I was in second grade, actually, out in Maine, and we've followed each other out west. He said, "Would you like to come in and just talk about your experience?" And I said, "Sure." So I'm just going to give you a quick talk about. I went to the first coding boot camp ever, the first cohort of the first coding boot camp ever. And it was a really wild ride. But a little bit about me, like first, before I jump into that experience is, as you know, my name's Matt. I currently work at Github. I've worked there for about 3 years now. And then before that, I worked at a company in Lehigh called MX, which is a financial software company. And at GitHub, I managed 3 different software engineering teams. I manage 2 that are customer facing and 1 that builds tools. So I manage 2 that go out, visit with customers, help them set up GitHub Enterprise, help them connect it to all their different tools in their infrastructure. Then also teach them how to do modern software development practices. And we've been doing that for 3 years. It's expanded a ton. And then I also manage and work with a team called the Services Tools team, which builds Ruby migration tools. So if someone's coming from like Bitbucket or a GitLab or SVN or whatever other code hosting tools there are, we make tools that migrate them off that in a very high fidelity way and move them into the GitHub platform. So that's a very fun job. I've worked with like people all over the world. I traveled a lot my previous time. And so that's a little bit about me. I've lived here for about 6 years, lived in Colorado before this, and grew up in Maine. And then I have some goals for our short discussion today. The first one is I'd like to give some insights from my experience into how to tackle a boot camp. For some of you that are almost graduating, that may be less applicable. For the people who are brand new, that may be more applicable. And then secondly, how to prepare to be employed. That's also a small part of coding boot camp and probably what you're all thinking about. And then how do I approach my role when I get hired? So I kind of wanted to give you just a little, from my experience, anecdotal, how you can tackle some of those different things. And then at the end, we're going to have lots of time for questions. So if you'd like to ask any questions, we can definitely do that at the end. There's going to be a common theme in this, and that's going to be have a beginner's mindset. So in lots of other areas of life, we are very incentivized to imply that we know everything and to act like we are well established and knowledgeable. I think that is a terrible mentality when you're learning how to code. You really need to approach it as if you're a complete beginner, and even once you're graduated from boot camp, you're still a beginner, and even now I'm still a beginner. Someone asked me today how to set up a reverse proxy for a very large telecom provider in Europe, and I was like, I could probably figure that out. So I still have that beginner's mindset. That was literally like 15 minutes ago that they asked me to help with that. So that is going to be the common theme throughout this. So how I would really describe that is really embrace that you are terrible. When I was in the coding boot camp, I was kind of like, oh, I got this. I'm good at learning things. And I was so bad, so bad, and did not really internalize that. And it was really costly for a while there for me. So really embrace, like, I have the ability to learn, but right now I am not good at this. And really embrace that and move forward with it. So to give you a little background about the coding boot camp that I attended, I had been trying to, I had this app idea. This was 2010 probably when this started off, and I had this app idea. It was terrible. I should have never pursued it. And I really wanted to build this thing. and I was working with some people on, we had spent tens of thousands of dollars on trying to build this thing. And the company that we were going to build it with, I ended up working for them, but they were terrible. And they were not going to build what we needed them to build. And I had a friend who was a software engineer at Amazon. So I reached out to him and asked him some guidance. And he said, oh, I'll build that in 2 weeks in Rails. It's this new hotness, that's out now, Ruby on Rails. And I'll build it for you. So then, I told him what it needed to be. 2 weeks later, he called back and said, actually, I'm buying a house right now. That's way too difficult. I can't do that right now, but you should just go do it. And I was like, I can't do that. I'm not even good at math. And he was like, that's not actually a thing. And you don't have to worry about that. So he told me about this, I think it's railstutorial.org. It's still out there in existence, but he told me about this. And I tried to go through the tutorial, and I got to the part where it said, in the terminal, it's like, on the Mac, it said, enter your password. And I was typing, and nothing was showing up on the screen. And instead of just typing and hitting enter, which would have been very reasonable, I spent 3 hours Googling how to enter a password into the terminal. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so difficult. And that was when I got to the point where I was like, I may need some help. Before this, for a little more background, I had graduated college with an English degree, went to law school for a while, was really interested in tech, didn't want to finish law school. So I was in sales at this time. So someone, David Heinemeier Hansen, who is one of the founders of Ruby, he's created Rails, the framework for Ruby. He tweeted one day and said, or him or Jason Fried, his partner at the company called Bootcamp, they tweeted and said, there's this crazy new idea for a coding bootcamp thing. This is interesting. And I was like, this is exactly what I need. So I tried very difficult. I tried very hard to get a spot in that original coding cohort. And somehow they accepted me in. So there was 20 of us or something like that for that first one. And everyone was like, this is probably some multi-level marketing thing, and you're going to get totally shafted of that money. And I was like, maybe, but we'll see how it goes. So I was living in Colorado at the time. I moved out and rented a couch for $200 a month in someone's apartment. My family, wife and kids moved to Utah back with my in-laws while I was out at that coding boot camp in Chicago. And I tried really hard to get good. It was the Wild West, you could say, of coding bootcamp days. It was the very first cohort, so there was a lot of things that they didn't do that would have been really great. For instance, they never checked in to be like, do you know anything? So that was a wildly positive change where it was super loose curriculum, no checking in. It was just we get in, we had a lesson for an hour and a half where they demonstrated something. So for instance, maybe it was authentication that day with a Rails gem. So we would do that, and then we would pair on it after he demonstrated it. And then it was we're off on our own. And all of us were there devoting full time for it. So I was at the coding bootcamp place like this. We were actually in Groupon's headquarters at that time because we didn't have space yet. And I was there all day, but there was about 3 or 4 hours of class. And so I'll tell you about my terrible approach. So how I did it was I would sit in the class and they would show it on the screen and I would think, that makes sense. I'm good. I got that. And that was pretty much where it ended. And so it was absolutely terrible. I would sit there and think, Ruby's very approachable language. So you can look at the code and feel like, I can suss out what that's saying. That makes sense. But that is not the hard part. And I realized that I never really tested my knowledge. So I would go to class would end, I would say, hey, let's go get lunch. We all like to eat. And then we'd go to lunch, and then I'd sit around other people and just, read some tech articles about my idea that I was also trying to build to get some inspiration. I would look through and just I'm going to look through that again to make sure that it works or that it makes sense to me still. And I never actually wrote the code. So that was an absolutely terrible approach. I did not fully embrace that I was a beginner. and just kind of winged it. And it was really costly for me. Like, I would estimate that of the people who consistently attended, because some people paid the money and did not consistently attend, I was the worst, is my estimation. So in terms of like actual retention and trying things out. Then there was this other guy in my class named Mike. And Mike was incredible. And I looked at Mike like an unattainable and also slightly unnecessary example of what people should do. But what Mike would do is we would go through the lesson, saying that, you know, we were in the same section and he would go through and recreate it twice right after class ended. So he'd have like a sandwich, because he was also very practical. He wanted to eat out every day. And he would sit there with his sandwich, and he would go through, and as soon as class ended, he would go and re-implement it twice. And then after that, he would then go around and find someone who was struggling with it and teach it to them as well. Because at that point, he knew it pretty well, and teaching it is the ultimate, you know, test of how well you know something. So he would then go around and teach it. So he would end at about 3 o'clock, you know, after having spent, you know, maybe an hour and a half to going through it, hour and a half of teaching, and then he would leave and have a lot of time. And I would stay there and spin my wheels for like 5 hours, not really doing anything productive, but not internalizing that I wasn't doing anything productive. And that was how it was. And Mike was hired super quickly after we finished. You know, he had a very, whatever we were implementing, he had like a little pet project, because it's all just crud kind of, you know, after you have gone through it, you realize it's all just create, read, update, and delete on different things. So he had, whatever we were implementing, he had this pet app. I think it was adding bicycle routes, because he was a big cyclist. He had this app that he could go and then show employees or employers. And he would go and show that to them, and he got hired at a consultancy, a really great consultancy right out of the school, which was incredibly impressive. So I'll jump now to so I left being like, I'm going to go build web applications for people because no one will want to hire me. And so I started going, I came back out to Utah because my family was here, and I was like, I'll just build some little apps for people. Like, I felt comfortable enough to build like a very, very simple CRUD app. So then I came out and I just started to reach out to people that knew Ruby. So I got back here and I went into LinkedIn and I typed Ruby. And then I looked to see who popped up. And the very first person who popped up was someone at MX named Bart. And Bart, I said, hey, I would really like to take you out to lunch and just ask you how to get involved in the Ruby community. I don't know anything about it in Utah. I don't even really know where to look other than this meetup group. And he said, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to come out. So, so I met him, and there was 2 other people with them, and they just started interviewing me at the lunch table. And I was like, hey, just so you know, I am terrible. And I think that they thought it was like just being humble. I was being super honest with them. And they, like, in hindsight, in Ruby, if you know, like, there's this error message, undefined method, you know, blank on array as an example. I got that and I was like, what could that cryptic message mean? That's how bad I was at this. And they still interviewed me, and then there was this like puzzle up on the wall, and they were like, yeah, we are up on a billboard at the time, and they, at the end of the meeting, they were like, you are way too green, but we're really interested. Why don't you just try to do that puzzle that we put up on the billboard? So the next morning I was like, I mean, if someone's gonna hire me, sure. So I went and looked up on the billboard, and it was like a base 64 encoded string. And the base 60, I didn't know that. I asked my Amazon friend what that meant, and he said, that's a base 64 encoded string. When you decode it in base 64, it was /height. So he said, oh, what they probably want you to do is to send a head request in, you know, with curl, which is like a HTTP request in the command line, send a head request to /height on their website. So I did that, and it was like, welcome, please post your name, your email address, and your, like, something about yourself. So I posted, you know, the things that they asked, and I said passionate and resourceful or something like that. And so then the CTO emailed me back. This is a very small company. I was employee 29 there, now it's hundreds. But the CTO emailed me back and said, hey, we're going up to, you've certainly caught my attention. We're going up to Sundance tonight to meet Lil Jon and have a party during his cabin. And I was like, sure. So he's like, let's interview. And I was like, when are we meeting? Like 2? And he's like, no, like 10, 11 at night. And I was like, this is a different kind of industry that I'm used to. So I went up there, we just hung out and we chatted. And then one of the engineers drove me back. And the next day they were like, hey, we want to hire you. So I said, yeah, that sounds really good, but can I come in to talk to you first? I'm really concerned about something. And they said, yes. And I came in and I said, hey, I'm really concerned because I am so bad at programming. I don't feel like you have fully understood how bad I am. And he, you know, Brandon just kind of laughed and was like, no, we know. He didn't know. And he was like, yeah, we still want to hire you. We'll just take a shot. So some things to pull out of that, I think, is that people who really understand their limitations, it feels less stressful to a hiring person, I think, than if they feel like you're trying to hide something and you're an unknown commodity. So if I interview people, I'm hiring 3 people right now. When I interview people, if they came and was like, hey, this is the role and these are the requirements you put up, I feel really confident in these 3. I don't feel confident in these 4. These are the learning plans that I have to figure out how to get familiar with those. I would feel about 100 times more confident hiring that person than someone who just says yes at every single thing. You know, we're going through and they're like, I got that, I'm amazing. Because very few people have all of the things under wrap. When you're interviewing with someone, you really want to stand out. And everyone says that since, like, I'm assuming a lot of you went to college, you know, like when you're chatting with the counselor, they're like, stand out. You're like, all right, I keep hearing that. What does that even mean? So I think that one of the easiest ways to do that here is, and my hiring experience was not typical. You just heard the story. That was like just stupid luck and somehow I got the job. This is like, there's some deliberate things that you can do. So for instance, if I was going to interview at a place like MX now, they make like mint.com style budgeting tools. I would go in and make a very simple accounts page, for instance, in React. I'm assuming a lot of you are learning React right now. Like, so in React, I would go and make an accounts page. And then I would add some transactions, you know, with some dummy data, make some transactions so you could click to one to the other. And then I would figure out how to make their little graphs that they have that show, you know, their budgets and things like that. And I would spend a week or 2 on this and feel the problems that they are encountering. You know, and then I would reach out to them and I would say, hey, I'm really interested. I've already applied. You already got that. That's like the super bare minimum of getting a job. You know, it's actually sending your application in. And then I would say, hey, I built this thing to replicate that. It's hosted on Heroku. You can go click through it for a couple minutes. These are the things that I super struggled with because remember, you are embracing that you are a beginner and terrible at everything. These are the things I really struggled with when I was trying to figure out how to do this. These are the things that I got, but I'm probably doing it wrong. How did you solve some of these problems? I'd love to take you out to lunch and just chat through that. I'm really interested in this problem space now after having gone through this little exercise. And that can help bridge the gap. You know, I use, you know, those green bicycles that are around here. I was in Boulder last week for work, and they had those, and I was here, and I encountered like 2 or 3 errors every single time I used that app. So I would find something like that and figure out why those errors are occurring and recreate the problems, and then go and say, I would love to help you solve these bugs. and I've tried it, you know, in this little React, you know, app. And this is something that I feel like I could figure out possibly what this one is, but I'd love to help, you know, move this forward. And that I think is a way to do it. And then also for open source, you've heard this a lot too, contribute to open source projects. My first probably 5 or 6 contributions to open source projects were fixing typos. Not very substantive, but that was at least getting my feet wet, demonstrating that I understood the GitHub flow and the Git flow. And then also people knew who I was, saw it, and then you can try to start diving into some more difficult things. And making a little, I'm assuming some of you have already made a portfolio site, having a couple projects in there that you've made where you recreate some functionality of a very general site and then explain through your thought process, that's super valuable. They really just want to know that you deliberately approach problems, you know, that you're a clear thinker when you're approaching these things. All right, so then when you get hired, so I have another story to say. So it's about my nephew and myself. So when I first got hired, I was terrified to say that I didn't know things, even though I was pretty comfortable. At that point, I was like, all right, they're good about that in the interview process, but once you actually get hired, you can never admit that you're terrible. So I kind of took that approach. My first task that they gave me was they said, okay, when we get a transaction in, we need to categorize that transaction. You need to go revamp that whole categorization mechanism. And I was like, what does that even mean in my head? But the words that I said were, sounds good. I like that. Yeah, it's a good first project. So I then went to my computer, sat down and said, if I was categorization, where would I live? And I didn't even, there was microservices at this company. They were a pioneering company in microservices. So there was like 15 different apps. I didn't even know which app to go in. I did not set myself up for success. I didn't say, hey, could you pair with me for like an hour to like show me where that even is? I just sat at my computer looking very blankly at my screen for about a month is my estimate for this. So after a while, they came in and they were like, hey, do you know how to program? And my answer was pretty solid no. But then they were like, all right, let's figure this out. So I have another story of my nephew too in a similar regard. So I helped him. He moved out here to get a job, and he was living at my house, and I was kind of teaching him how to code. And I would notice that no matter what I said, no matter how complex, and I said, do you have that? He would say, yep, I got that. And I was skeptical about this, but I just kind of rolled with it. And then I helped him get a tech job as tech support at a local company. So he got let go after about 2 months. And I was almost positive I knew why he got let go. And I was chatting with him. And the reason is when someone asked, gave him a project, he would say he was a yes person. Like he never wanted to imply he didn't know things. So he'd be going through and saying, they'd be giving him instructions like, yep, got that, similar to me. And then when they actually asked him to go implement it, he was pretty lost and had no idea what to do. So I bring that up to say that when you get hired, it'd be really great both in the interview process and when you get hired to share your faults with people and to also in the gaps in knowledge and to help them solve this. So because the problems that you will encounter when you start are actually somewhat similar to the problems that a senior engineer will start. So for instance, when we onboard a person at GitHub onto our team, there's a ton of things that they need to know. And one of the hardest things for every company to do is document those things. to have people know what it is that, like on a day-to-day basis, where things are, and to have a very easy place to go and get the context of their role. So if I was starting as a new hire again, I would pitch that as part of the helpfulness of having me on board. So I would say, hey, there's a lot of things probably too that you are all struggling with because you're a young company or something like that. You don't have a ton of time to document things. When I start, I would love to help make that repeatable for other people who start after me and actually document those things so that there's a really consistent path forward for people at any part of the process. Companies pay us at GitHub lots of money per day to come out and pretty much have them tell us their process and for us to document it for them and then give them improvements on that process. but really, they have never actually deliberately sat down and said, how do we move code here? It's this person joined, they were the original person who created the code. They work there, they hire 3 or 4 more people, and then that person leaves. The other people get it just from, cult knowledge of, the company and sitting around each other and looking over and being like, hey, how do I do this? And they haven't actually deliberately documented that process. So that's something that you all could do really well is you could actually say, I'm going to be the person who actually makes this a very deliberate thing that we do. And that actually, it's like, you're a great guinea pig to expose the problems. If it's not documented well, then you're going to really struggle when you join the company to figure out how to do it, and you can help in that regard. So something I would do as well is, let's say you start up and you're not just writing documentation, you actually get to write code. And someone says, hey, I would like you to go do this thing. The very first thing that I would do is figure out what file that I'm probably going to be working in. There's at least probably one file. And I would go and make a small change. And then I would open up a pull request immediately with just that tiny change and say, hey, I'm working on this. I'm pretty sure it's going to be in this file that I'm working on it. I'm new. I'd really love to have all of your expertise and institutional knowledge for how I can do this well. This is how I'm thinking about solving this problem. And then the very first top comment on that pull request, I would write out how you're planning on approaching it. And then say, could I get some review on this to make sure I'm going down the right path? And that is fantastic, because instead of you working for like 3 or 4 weeks, which was my second project at MX, 3 or 4 weeks, and then being like, oh, that other person's wrong, I'm not taking that approach anymore, let's do this other approach. You're getting people to have the conversation immediately. And you're really making sure that they're teaching you also as you're actually getting some jobs, so they can tell you some tips about how to go through that. And I would create a learning path as well. So when you get hired, if there's things that you are deficient at, I would figure out who is your manager, whoever you're working with closely, and I'd create a learning path. So I would say, hey, I really don't feel comfortable with authentication. That's a weak spot that I have. Can I take some time, if that's part of your responsibility, can I take some time on Friday to go and do these 3 or 4 tutorials and read through these code bases? So it's just showing a very deliberate approach to learning can be really helpful as well. And then another thing to consider, and this is just general, is for most jobs, the people who rise to the top, there's a lot of biases and things like that are in there as well for who rises to the top, but a lot of the people who get considered top performers are those who move things forward, in whatever case that may be. So that is something that I would really internalize when you start is okay. Like for instance, for me, for categorization, I got very loose requirements for categorization when they gave me that project. And I should have been much more deliberate about it and said, what is our ultimate goal? What is the ultimate thing that I'm responsible to deliver? Because just take this 200-line method and break it up into smaller ones and refactor it is rather nebulous. So taking that and getting explicit requirements about it, and then working towards that goal and saying, how can we move forward this according to the goal that we have? That is really huge. And then also, I would say that on the team that I manage about, I don't remember, 13 to 15 people right now. And there's a lot of different approaches for styles. By far, I would say the people who do the best are the naturally curious. Those are just the people that really thrive. So there's many people on the team who, if I went and said, hey, can you go and write a tutorial on how to launch GitHub Enterprise? They would do that, and they would do the very bare bones version of it. The ones who really, really excel are the ones who run into something and say, how does that work? And then they dive down a little bit lower. And we had one team member who joined, and I would say within probably 5 or 6 weeks he was a very seasoned engineer, but for this new space that he had never really worked in, he was rather new, and he had dove in very deeply into how the appliance worked, how you could reconfigure things, and then he was training other people and immediately had established himself as a go-to resource on the team within his first couple months when other people had been there for years. And I think the reason was that he was curious and was diving down and saying, I got that, but I want to know the next level. Now, the flip side of that is there's tons of rabbit holes that you can go down that do not pertain to your actual job at hand. So try to balance those two things, which can be very difficult. But I would say really try to balance that and try to figure out, okay, what will help me do being explicit about requirements, what will help me understand these requirements better and deliver on these better. And then that's about it. So I went to that coding bootcamp almost 7 years ago now. There's a lot of boot camps now. If you did notice, like some went out of business, some have stayed and thrived. But I think it's been an incredibly positive transition from the previous way of just going to college and getting educated that way. It's been a fantastic transition, and looking back on my career now of 6 or 7 years in this, actually, let me tell you one more anecdote. So when I was at that company and they were like, hey, do you know how to program? And I was like, no. They said, let's give you a little test. So they gave me a test of, do you know these classes in Ruby well enough? Can you have, state, do you understand the concept of state? Just really remedial things that I was learning. So I studied for that test, took the test, and I ended it on a Friday. And they were going to review it over the weekend and get back to me on Monday to tell me how I did. So I knew that I did poorly on Friday after I took the test. And they went in there and he was like, all right, so how do you think you did? And I said, I think I did terrible. And I think you're going to fire me on Monday. However, I'm going to study like crazy for the next 3 months and become so good that you have to hire me back. And so let's see how this goes. And he was like, okay. So I didn't remember this, but when I was leaving that company to go to GitHub, this is years and years after this, I'd become relatively good at that point. He was like, I said, hey, you should have fired me many times and you didn't. Thank you for that. And he said, do you remember what you said to me when you told me that you were going to fire? And I was like, no, when you told me that. And he's like, after you said that, I went to the CEO and was like, we can't fire him. He's too passionate. So what can we do to keep him around? And so then they said, okay, we have developers at banks and credit unions and all these things that we work with. No one else wants to talk to other humans that are our engineers, really. And he came from sales, so let's move him into this technical role that's customer facing. So I went over and did that, and I love that way more than programming full time. So it was a really interesting blend of like working with people, helping, code to APIs and help architecting, like how to use the APIs. And my boss there, when I moved over that role, was a great teacher and actually kind of gave me the teaching that was available when I was in the coding bootcamp, but I was too slow to recognize. So that's another thing, is show dedication. When you get that first gig, definitely show that you're willing to put in pretty much anything necessary to keep moving forward. So that's it. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful in some way. And I can open it up for questions now if anyone has any questions. Yeah.
How do you started the first bootcamp, so you didn't really have too much of the negative stereotypes about bootcamp.
Yeah.
Like I feel that there's a lot of companies that are like, oh, you're a bootcamp graduate. I mean, I hear that other ones are like, they think it's cool because you can actually learn fast. Yeah. But like, how do you go about telling them that's what your education was? Like, you're terrible, but it's like, you're terrible on, you just learn on your own, or you're just terrible?
Yeah. So I think there's an interesting dynamic right now, and this is certainly different based on where you're applying. Some places will look at it and it'll just be an automatic disqualification. Some places only hire from graduates from Ivy League. So, but to give you an anecdote, I've hired people that were very much so self-taught, kind of like, boot camp style as well. And then also we hired another person who graduated from Harvard. I did not know that one of the people graduated from Harvard when they were hired, and I did not know that the other person went to boot camp. Because as soon as you get like your foot in the door and they're evaluating it, give them something to take the focus off of your education. Like if you really like my cohort team member Mike, he really liked cycling, so he gave them the cycling example app, spoke intelligently about what he struggled with when he was building it, what he thought he did pretty well, what he would do if he had extra chances to go for it. He talked about how he approached testing. He asked them some perceptive questions about testing and the struggles that you have to replicate data for a good test suite. We talked about all of these things, and if you do that, then the school is not even on their radar.
So you just distract them.
Yeah. Well, but you distract them by pointing to like, this is what I'm actually doing the job. You know, like, did I go to a coding boot camp or did I go to the University of Utah? That is not really applicable if both applicants are sitting there being like, this is how I would solve this problem. This is how I would solve this problem is by far the more interesting aspect of that person sitting in front of you than what school did you go to. So, so I would, like if I was doing it, I wouldn't even necessarily be like, hey, I went to a boot camp and I want to get a job at your place. I'm not saying like I wouldn't hide it either. I would have it very prominently put on my resume, my LinkedIn profile and things like that. But but that's not an interesting conversation because how many people reach out and they're like, hey, I just graduated from a boot camp, I'd love to talk to you. That is the very common phrase that people use. I would be a little bit different, well, and then all of you are different, all of you are the same. But I would go out and say, hey, I replicated this bit of functionality. I saw that you have a job post on there. I'd love to chat about that and just kind of walk through how I approach that. You know, and then if that's not the focus. The focus is like, how I think of hiring now is reducing risk for the person hiring. Like that's really what it is. It's like, who is the least risky hire out of all these people? Like, so when I first joined MX, I sucked hours of time from the senior engineers to help them solve bugs. So I was an incredibly risky hire for them. But if there was someone who could come in, knew their limitations well, knew how to learn, knew how to stack Overflow and Google, which are the two probably biggest programming skills that there are. You know, like you know how to go through and solve the problems, and they feel like they can give you a little bit of guidance. Like maybe they just jump in to that original comment that you put in your pull request of like, this is how I think I'm going to approach this. They jump in there and say, hey, you're right about this, wrong about this, take this approach. And cost them 15 minutes of just quick review writing out a comment. That is someone who they're like, okay, it's totally fine for us to hire that person even though they're terrible. Like as an example, the CTO of my company said, if there are 6 bugs a week that get solved by a junior person and they're very simple bugs, and I can pay someone $5,000 a month to solve those 6 bugs, that is far more, and it takes them 40 hours to solve 6 bugs that would take me 10 hours to solve. That would be a far better thing for our business because I need to take my brain, you know, and solve harder problems. And I don't care about those problems. We just want them solved so the bank stops saying, hey, that bug is still open. So you really need to internalize that and be like, I'm assuming that for some of you, $5,000 or $6,000 a month would be acceptable to leave here. And if you could go in and say, hey, I know that I can tackle these bugs that you're experiencing. You know, I know that I can go in there with very little oversight, still give me some oversight, but very little oversight, and take these off your plate, then you are worthwhile to them to bring on board. And if you can also help them improve their processes, you know, do these different things, then you're valuable and you're worth it. And then also, if a year down the road, they've invested 15 to 20 minutes per day on giving you some guidance, and then you're a mid-level engineer, you know, you can solve problems pretty well, then that risk is totally worth their time. You know, so just like incubators are trying to like incubate like 5 or 6 companies in the hope that one of them pays off. If a junior person can become a mid-level person at a company, that is incredibly valuable for that company. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, I would focus on problems to be solved and not where you went to school. Because it's all just problems to be solved. Yeah.
So when you talk about, you know, getting in front of them to explain those problems, how do you get from the stack of resumes to in front of people? Yeah. You mentioned LinkedIn, but I mean, I'm not going to know everybody at every.
Yeah.
You know, you just have to use your connections.
So Sam and I went to a meetup a few weeks ago, and we sat down and we were just chatting and with these people that worked at a company here, and you know, it just came up like, hey, what is your place like? You know, just I would go to meetups and meet people. You know, I would go to different things like this, and I would certainly reach out to people and say, hey, you know, I'm looking for a mentor. I recently graduated from a boot camp. I would love to like take you out to lunch. I'll donate some money to your favorite charity as well if you would like. You know, like
I'd like to take you out to lunch.
I will go out to lunch with you. That's not a problem at all. So yeah, like just try to get in front of people and just open up the conversation. That's really how people get jobs. Unless you have an incredible resume where they just look like there are certain resumes when I'm doing resumes now where I'm like, I'd certainly like to call that person and talk to them. I would love for them to work with us. There's other people who have just reached out to us, you know, and gotten in front of us just from, you know, picking up the phone or sending an email or something like that. So I also, there's one other thing that I would like to share about that is also be selective about where you work. You know, beggars can't be choosers. So there's that aspect of it as well. But I went to this engineering leadership meeting, and there was this lady, Jocelyn Goldfine, who's an incredible follow on GitHub or on Twitter, by the way. But she said that when you're really young in your career, you should be optimizing where you work based on how often you get feedback. So if you go to a company and they release software twice a year, you get about 2 times to know if your software, like, you know, or if you go and they don't have code review, you know, or if you go and, you know, there's a whole bunch of variations on this, but especially code review. When I was interviewing at places, if I was interviewing at places now, I would say, I want to get better, and you all know a lot of things about developing software and moving software forward. What opportunities will I have to get feedback on where I'm wrong? You know, and where and how will I know if I'm doing things that are not going to work well? Is there a code review? You know, if there's something that I want to pair on, what opportunities will I have to pair on things? And when I interview people and they're just yes people the whole time, that concerns me. If I interview someone and they're like, tell me how I'm going to succeed in this role, and you know, in a non-demanding way, but like, please help me get insight into like. I don't want to come and underperform. That's how I would describe it. I would say, I don't want to come and underperform and have this not work out for either of us. Can you help me understand how we'll set it up so that I can hit the ground running and contribute, and what opportunities I'll have to get feedback from you all on things that I'm doing well, not doing well, code review, things like that. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, thanks for the tips. They were amazing.
Yeah.
Really good. What happened in your project? You said in the beginning you had a project which was a terrible.
Oh, I was at that phase where I thought that ideas were valuable. So, and they're not. So they are not valuable. It's all like the execution and things like that behind it. So I worked on it off and on, and then I realized this is not a legitimate business idea in any way whatsoever. And then I moved on to other things. So I actually worked on a side project with a couple coworkers at that first company, MX. We worked on a side project as well and built it and sold it to someone, and they run their business on it now. And like, I still have to maintain that site, and I go, if any of you want to maintain a Rails site, let me know. But I got to go back now, and I'm like, oh, that code, oh my gosh. And that was something that I did there. So we've done a couple ideas. I usually have at least a side project or 2 that I'm interested in that I just kind of dabble with, because I don't code as much now, and I like coding. So
I was asking because more like beginners.
yeah.
We think that we may have that idea, but we probably don't even have like the knowledge.
Yeah.
So, and usually those projects, they take huge teams, so a lot of developers, but we don't know that.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how
Yeah.
when you realize that.
So I would say a couple different things. So I didn't recognize that I was solving a problem that no one cared about. That was possibly the biggest thing. And I would say, so for you, if you're looking at a project, like, look for problems. You know, what problems do you encounter? You know, like, that's a huge thing, is to say, you know, there's tons of little tiny app ideas that you could do that are just something trivial. Like, for instance, I coach my son's soccer team and my daughter's soccer team, and it is terrible. Like, text lists and email lists and all of these things. And I'm like, I want a tool that does this, like, that I don't have to go and search the calendar in ridiculous places to see where the game is. Like, that's something that I'm currently experiencing that I hate. like I actually am finishing my basement, and I went and submitted my permit to get my basement finished, and it was like a terribly non-technical, terrible way to solve this problem in my city. And I was thinking, wow, just like a system for submitting permit applications, that governments could use, local governments, that would be fantastic. And it's super simple. It's like you have a concept of a permit. You upload a file to it with your file. Like, these are all things that you often solve very easily after you graduate, and you could take something like that and say, hey, local government that is small and hates managing these manually, can I work with you to figure out how we can use this little system I built to manage our permitting process? And I think a lot of them would say, for sure. And when you say, like, the price right now will be free, then they may even be more interested in that. Like, you're a beginner, and you're terrible. So if you internalize that, you don't want to charge people for terrible software. So you go and you say, but I can solve your problem, and I will be very dedicated in solving it if you work with me to figure out how we can solve it. So, how many of you know of thumbtack.com? How many of you, yeah, so you know the functionality. That is incredibly trivial from a software perspective. The hard part on that is the execution that I was mentioning earlier, like getting critical mass to actually have people bid on projects and someone posts them. But from a technical standpoint, it's a very trivial app. To have an MVP, I would say. Obviously, every project takes it's like 20% of the time to get 80% of the way there. 80% of the time to add that last 20% of polish. So every app is difficult in that sense, but to get an MVP up that you could show to an employer or to just potentially start a business could be pretty approachable. Yeah.
So I know that in most industries, when you go into an interview, the approach is you want to be able to be, personable. You often don't have to demonstrate your ability, like I've slid by into jobs that I did not deserve in multiple occasions, and I've done very well. But what do you do to help yourself? I'm more doing like mock interviews. I find myself getting nervous as I'm trying to, do this stuff in front of somebody or pseudocode. What helped you to be able to, or what do you think could help? Just kind of get that down.
So that's lots of different possible answers. So how I think of that is when I interviewed at Github, for instance, I had failed as a programmer in my first few months. Then I had been in this new role for 2.5 years, 3 years at that point, and I done really well in that role. I've been promoted multiple times in that role. So that one I really grabbed on me, but I still had intense imposter syndrome. And so when I was interviewing at GitHub, they flew me up to San Francisco, and I went into one of the interviews, and it was Scott Chacon who wrote ProGit. Literally wrote the book on Git. He was one of the founders of GitHub. And it was Kyle Daigle, who's now he speaks at GitHub Universe as one of the keynote speakers of he's over the platform of GitHub, like APIs and different things like that. I walked into the room and I knew them, and I was like, oh. But I think that and this is it's a lot of it depends on personality too, I feel as well. But from the part that's not personality, I think what is the problem at and so if they ask you a question that you don't know, one of the things that I would say is I don't know, and embrace that you are a beginner. You know what I mean? So if they're like, hey, tell me about this algorithm. That's one of the things that boot campers are often most efficient in, is they don't go in sorting algorithms and things like that. First of all, if that's the kind of question that they're asking, hopefully that's very pertinent to the role, because that's terrible question. I GitHub actually, how I do interviewing is I give them a project and I say, complete that at some time, show your work, show us the problems that you're encountering and where you're struggling with, and then we'll have a conversation about it. They can tell us stuff. So it's really just coding isn't a high pressure scenario. It's not like someone sitting there with a timer looking at you while you code. That's not reality. So giving the people challenges like that, or being like, hey, person who's very nervous, whiteboard this. That's
I see you're
so-
sweating profusely. Would you like to do that some more?
yeah. But what I would do though is I would even say something like, I don't know the answer to this. I don't know how to do that, but I'm confident that I can figure it out, given some time. So I'm going to walk you through how I would approach getting the knowledge to solve this problem. And I would kind of change it into like, this is how I think through things instead. So if someone, for instance, someone was like, hey, you set up this proxy for me, Matt. I have set up 0 proxies in my case, but I understand what they are. I understand them from like a, help guides conversation from Github. So if we turn that around and made that an interview thing, I would say, this is how I would first approach this problem. I would look to see if anyone had documented this in our help, threads. So in Zendesk, have we already answered this problem before? I would go and search there so I don't pull any of your time away from that. Then I would go and look through those and say, okay, what is the most realistic that we can do for this customer given their constraints, make sure I know their constraints really well. And then I would say, I will then go and set this up. So I'll go set up a GitHub Enterprise server, and then I'll go set up the proxy based on our documentation and the help threads that I can see that are helping to solve this. I would test it, write down the things that I know, ask some other people to review it, and then I would come back and try to give it a solution. So if you do that, then they're automatically not thinking like, how good is this person at the sorting algorithm? They're like, it's now, how do they approach problems? And that is incredibly interesting to them. So don't let them ask irrelevant questions, I would also say. And that could be potentially irrelevant questions. So what is the problem at hand, just think through. And then also, if you don't know, I would say I don't know. So I would say I'm not very good at that. I've never done that before. This is how I would try it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then also they will also say, okay, if this person gets hired, they will admit to me when they do not know something, which is incredibly valuable. So, yes. Anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned working on. Okay, we're all gonna be beginners. We're junior developers.
Yeah.
Working on open source versus freelancing,
Yeah.
which is different a little bit, and then personal projects.
Yeah.
Where we should try to, focus, or it's like a huge jungle for us right now.
Yeah.
Where we should.
So I would assume that most of you need income at some point. So there's that rub. So you have to figure out where you fall in terms of that as well. However, I think the main thing for employers is again reducing that risk of hiring you. So you need to show them something, and it could be a closed source project that you built for someone else, where you tell them about the functionality of it. And you can't show them the code necessarily, but you can tell them about the functionality, what you struggled with, different things like that. So I would say though that open source projects are likely to bring you to places that you're not technically able to go yet. If someone was like, go refactor this class in Bootstrap, you're like, that'd be fun, but I'm not quite there yet, kind of a thing. But your own personal project, you could know it well. So it could even be like a calendaring app for B-School. You could just make even something as simple as that. So I would make a project. I would start class with a project that I have in mind, and every single time you get a lesson, I would then go say, okay, I'm gonna go add that somewhere in my project. Your project can be the most ridiculous web application ever that's doing like 15, 20 different totally unrelated things. That's not important. What's important is that you can talk them through how you did it, you can show them that you've done it, and you can give them an example, and then say like, this is my smorgasbord of everything that we learned, very strangely implemented, and that can be really helpful. So I would have something that you are passionate about, and figure out how to approach that, and then be building that while you're going. Also, I've given that advice to like roughly 100% of the people that I've talked to about this, and like 4 have done it out of those many people. So really do it. Like, think of something like so. For instance, my kids are arguing a lot lately about chores and if they did their chores or not, and how much allowance we should give them. That could be a little web application, something stupid and trivial like that. You could just make a little app like the allowance, or something like that, and like go through and make sure like the kids go in and check off, when they've done their chore, and then it automatically calculates like how much, it adds up the amount of money that for allowance that's going to add. There's like so many different possibilities, and you can burn it literally after you get a job. Like you can delete the repo and banish it from your memory. You'll be employed then. And once you get the first job, it is trivially easy to get the second job. Yeah, it's just that first job that is hard. So
along those same lines, what I just want to make sure I kind of grasp it. It's less important because I get stuck on the has to be great.
no,
Yeah.
it can
It's
be
less important what it is, more important what it does. Like
Yeah.
it demonstrates the big.
yes.
Less important than it's this amazing idea.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Like when you're first implemented, like when you're your first day, like I don't know if they teach you like the order of the curriculum, but like let's say they're doing strengths and arrays. One of the first apps I made was pick whose turn it is in the word game randomly. I had an array of everyone in our family's name, because the kids would argue about whose turn it was. And so then I just just called the method and went through that and picked out one of the people in it. Like that is how simple the app could be. How many of you have heard of Jennifer DeWalt? Search jenniferdewalt.com on your computers right now. She did 180 websites in 180 days.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, this is a perfect example. I remember seeing her tweet and seeing like the CEO of Dropbox and all these CEOs when she posted being like, hey, I'm really interested in talking to you. So literally she just took like, this is the example of like you get taught in class, you go do it twice, and then you go help someone learn it. You walk around class and say, I already did this, can I help someone learn this? So go look at her 100 websites and 180 sites in 180 days. At the beginning it was super trivial. It was like pick which door the egg is behind or something like that. There was 3 doors and you picked one and you either got it or didn't. Like that's how she started off. It is super stupid. So and then by the end of her 180 days, she was building things of substance. So if you do something like this, you will get hired. Yeah. Because again, you reduce the risk. It doesn't matter what the site is about, they know that you can do these different things. Show, don't tell. That's what I would say. Show them what you can build. And actually spend the time after flexibility.
In that scenario, I've got a project I did a long time ago I no longer had access to because I'm no longer with that company. I look at the stuff I do now and I would not do the same things the same way, but I don't really, I'm in a situation where I don't really want to show off that project because they implement also scripting protection stuff like that.
Oh, I would show that off.
Okay.
And say, here's a site that I did where I did not implement cross-site scripting. And just be very open and not like, people love transparency.
Content security policy, all that stuff.
Yeah.
That I would do.
And say, I'm learning these things now, and I'd love to learn more about it as well. So I would have it like in your LinkedIn or your resume, like have 3 or like if you've done a couple of these projects, have really detailed readings, wherever you're hosting it, that explain like how to launch the site, what you learned about it. Like you can write a novel inside of that reading. And then point people to that and say, hey, I know you get a ton of people applying for this role and I'm new, but if you want to see what I can do, go check out my README. Just even that would be different and stand out a little bit from outside of the norm. Anything else? It goes by really quickly. So, all right, thanks for having me.
And for you guys that you class, I'll be posting more information about that after this. So
So we'll just plan on leaving around 2:15. I think we're at the Galvin Center, so, just don't forget. 1 and 2:30. And this will be Brian, you guys, will be fun.
Come back. Yeah. That'd be fun. I can polish it up a little. Oh, that's great. Hey,